This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome to a presentation of AcumatiScan by Core Associates. AcumatiScan is an enterprise workflow automation system that was built around the concept of AP routing and approval. Over the course of time, it has expanded beyond just accounts payable to include all documents and content that can be managed, routed, and stored within AcumatiScan and also viewed in Acumatica. AcumatiScan also includes mobile approval of accounts payable invoices. The automated workflow system was designed from the concept of allowing for purchase to pay and routing and approval of all invoices and documents using a rules-based routing system. Core Associates was established in 2004. Many of the Acumatica business partners have been Core Associates business partners for many years. Core originally designed a product called TimberScan that was designed specifically for Sage 300 CRE. Over the course of the last 16 years, Core Associates has over 2,000 clients that use their products and over 35,000 users. The AcumatiScan application was designed with the principles and the concepts that were used for Sage 300 CRE. AP routing and approval replicates the Acumatica AP distribution grid, so users don't have to learn two entry systems. They can enter their invoices in one place in AcumatiScan, and everything is tied directly back to Acumatica. It also allows for things like electronic invoice packets, where all supporting documents and checks can be attached to the invoice and then viewed automatically in either Acumatica or AcumatiScan. It is a complete purchase-to-pay solution with the idea of never having to touch the paper along the way. Starting with the process of acquiring AP invoices. In that process, there are tools such as email monitoring and acquire automation that eliminate having to actually handle the paper to actually acquire the documents. And then using capture OCR, optical character recognition, the data entry is eliminated. Other tools such as a project-centric mobile approval application where it has industry-leading AP automation and approvals from anywhere. Could be on a phone, could be on an iPad, could be on a desktop. It makes no difference. AcumatiScan is more than just AP invoices. As mentioned, it manages all documents and content, and then those documents and content can be linked to records inside Acumatica. It also includes a flexible search and query tool to allow users to be able to set up their own inquiries and their own reports. Soon to be added to the AcumatiScan portfolio will be an integration to Procore, where Procore invoices can originate in the Procore portal and then be automatically consumed into AcumatiScan so that they can be managed and potentially routed for review and approval in AScan. And also soon to be added to AcumatiScan will be a cloud-based credit card expense and reconciliation program. The last PowerPoint slide before we actually go into the product is a workflow depiction of how invoices are processed using AcumatiScan. Everything starts at the point where an invoice arrives at the client's door. Those invoices get acquired. There are a number of different ways in which that occurs, but after they've been acquired, they get assigned to what is known as initial data entry. This is where the end user is typically someone in accounts payable, and it could be more than one person, is entering the invoices in AcumatiScan, and then all of that information is pushed automatically back to Acumatica. Once the invoice has been saved and sent off for approval, the approvers have the opportunity to use whatever tool they want It uses a responsive user interface to be able to allow for approving invoices, whether it's on a phone, an iPad, or any other type of device. And once the approval process is complete, the invoices and all of the supporting documents all the way to the check are available in Acumatica as well as in AcumatiScan. So at this point, we will go into the products and we'll start working our way through the workflow application. I've already logged into both Acumatica and AcumatiScan. I'm going to go into the payables section of Acumatica, and we will hold tight here for just a moment. So with Acumatica, obviously the menu is designed with the side panel, and then as anything is selected, it then brings up that particular process in the main window. If you'll notice with AcumatiScan, the system was designed the same way. It has the side panel view with all of the various applications on the side. And then as any of these particular applications are selected, it opens up that particular function into the main body of the system. At any time, if the user wants to return back to home, you simply click on the wheel and it takes you back to where you originated. So we're going to start at the point where an invoice arrives at the user's door, and then they're going to go through the process of walking through the workflow associated with AcumatiScan. Along the way, we're going to be talking about several other tools, such as Acquire Automation, which we'll get to in a moment, and also the ability to set up what are called capture templates for OCR, optical character recognition processing. So let's get started. I'm going to go into the acquire function, and then just for the moment, we're going to suspend these two particular functions here, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But I'm going to just fill these in, and then we'll go out and we'll acquire some invoices. So there are several ways in which this can take place. One option could be that I could drag and drop documents. So if I have something that's sitting on my desktop or perhaps in a file, maybe it's an email conversation that I want to just drag and drop to the screen. Simply drag and drop, and then once we hit the continue button, it opens up those particular documents and content into the main viewer. All of the annotation tools for AcumatiScan are shown here at the top. If I want to size the document, make it larger or smaller on the screen, I simply use the zoom in and zoom out control buttons. Now this is a two-page document. The first page is sitting in front of me, the second page is in the thumbnail view. And as I see, the first page shows me that this is invoice 393. In the thumbnail view, if I go to the second page, I do have a second invoice. Typically what AcumatiScan will try to do is it will try to separate the invoices automatically. But in this case, because SES sent us two invoices in one PDF, the system recognized that as if it were a two-page invoice. So to split it, it's very simple. You simply right-click on a document, you can split, and I've now separated the documents as needed. And then if I wanted to proceed forward, I simply hit the acquire button, and that will then take those invoices and send them on to AP invoice entry for processing. So drag and drop is one option. A second option would be invoices that arrive in the mail. In that case, what the user would do is they would take those invoices, put them onto their scanning device, and scan them to a file which we would link to AcumatiScan. Again, all the end user has to do here is simply come in and select that file. Those invoices that were scanned are now sitting in the file, and I'll just go grab a stack of them here. And when I hit the open button, they all open up into the viewer, and we simply proceed forward as need be. In this case, because these were separate PDFs, you see how the system automatically separated them for me. Let's talk about one other option, actually two other options. Email monitoring. So AcumatiScan has an email monitoring tool associated with it. What it does is it's watching an email address. And as invoices arrive at that email address, it will automatically take the invoice and pull it from the email. And then there are two options with which the user can choose to proceed forward. So we'll call it the simplest option would be to have those invoices get dropped into a file, similar to as if they had been scanned. So in that case, what the end user would do is they would simply come in, they would select from that email file, and they would just choose those particular invoices and pull them in. What is the advantage here? What it is that someone doesn't have to manually monitor an email address, and they don't have to manually drag and drop each particular emailed invoice into the system one by one. It creates the file of invoices that were emailed automatically, and then the user can simply come in and select all of those invoices at once and open them up in a batch. Now, there's a more advanced version or feature to the email monitoring. It is known as acquire automation or auto acquire. The way the auto acquire function works is it goes a couple of steps further beyond just the ability to monitor an email address and drop them into a file. What that does is it says, reads where the invoice is coming from and where it's being received. So what email address is it coming into? And then it also can assign those invoices to the person or group in data entry that needs to process those invoices. It can split the invoices if perhaps, like we saw with SCS, where they had more than one invoice that came in the PDF. It can start to look for some key information to allow it to be able to split the invoice. And then finally, what it can also do is it can apply the optical character recognition components to the invoice if need be. So what does that do? Let's go back here to the acquire. And let's step through this process one more time, just so that we can recap how the auto acquire can save the end user a tremendous amount of time. First, if I'm acquiring invoices, normally what I would have to do is I would have to select who I'm going to assign the invoices to. Now remember, if we think back to the PowerPoint slide, this is not the person or group of people that are going to be approving the invoices. This is the initial data entry person, the person or group in accounts payable that's going to take the invoice and start the entry process in AcumatiScan. So we select that particular person or group. We select what type of document it is. So we're going to say invoices. Then we would have to go through and select those invoices from the file. And we would have to choose to acquire those invoices and proceed forward from there. If we think about the auto acquire function, what that is doing is it's eliminating all of those steps. I don't have to pull the invoices from a file. I don't have to assign them. I don't have to determine what type of document it is, and I don't have to split them. All of those tools have already been built into the auto acquire, so it eliminates those steps and it assigns the invoice automatically to the person or group in accounts payable invoice entry. So creating that efficiency where no one has to touch anything along the way. So at this point, I'm going to take this Payne Electric invoice and go ahead and acquire it, just so we have it in the system. Okay, so next step in the process is we go into accounts payable invoice entry so that we can start processing invoices. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We'll go into AP invoice entry. And I want to look at this from several different perspectives. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this CARM design invoice. Now, a couple things that you'll notice here. First of all of the coding for this particular invoice has already been completed. The vendor number, the date, the amount, all of that information, including the line items of that particular invoice. Now, how did it get this information? It did so by using the optical character recognition or capture tool to be able to read information from the invoice, automatically populate the invoice entry screen, and because this particular invoice references a purchase order number, it looks at the purchase order and then pulls in all of the line items from the purchase order. So in essence, this is a scenario where I, as an end user, don't have to touch anything. I can look at this. If I needed to override something, it gives me that capability. I can always work my way across and I can change anything that I need to. But hypothetically, if all of the information, including the PO lines that had been acquired, were fine here, I could simply go out. If I needed to attach any supporting documents to the invoice, I could, and I could simply save the invoice, and then AcumatiScan would invoke the business rules and would send that invoice off for review and approval. Again, creating the efficiency. So if we think back, we could potentially have acquired this invoice using the auto acquire function, which no one had to touch anything in order to get the invoice into this queue. And then because of the fact that it applied the optical character recognition tools, all of those line items have already been coded, and I simply send the invoice off for approval. That's how quick and how efficient invoices can be processed. Now let's take a different scenario. Let's go to the next invoice. So the next invoice in the stack is one for asphalt and paving. Here's a slightly different scenario. So in this case, again, we applied the accounts payable, we applied the capture OCR components to this, and it built all of the information. But this wasn't referencing a purchase order or a job, for example, or project, so it didn't fill in the line items. So I have the opportunity, if I want, where I could come in and I could fill in all this information myself, and then I can simply send it off if I need to. Or the other option is, if I only know certain information, maybe I'm not sure maybe I know what the project is, but I don't know anything other than, let's say, the project. I don't know how it's supposed to be coded. AcumatiScan gives you the opportunity to partially code an invoice and send it off for review and approval, and let the approvers go through the process of completing the coding. So again, in many circumstances, when an invoice arrives in accounts payable initially, that accounts payable person or group may not know exactly how the invoice needs to be coded. So instead of having to put some information on the invoice that might have to be then redone, deleted, rejected, and what have you, you can simply leave the invoice in whatever format that you want, send it off for review and approval, and then that invoice can be coded on the approver's end. We were talking about supporting documents a moment ago. Simple. We simply call up the supporting documents. If I happen to have, let's say, a purchase order, and I need to be able to view it, I can go look at it on the screen. I can see it. If that's the purchase order that I need, I can select it. You can keep it open if it needs to be applied to additional invoices. I save that, and then it attaches that particular purchase order to that particular invoice. Another thing that you'll notice here is with the invoice entry screen, we've been kind of focusing somewhat on the OCR component so far and also the coding, but you'll notice that in this case, the invoice itself is in a format where I'm not necessarily seeing the entire invoice as I'm going through the data entry, and I might want to be able to do that. So a couple of things here. You can shrink this. I can make this a little bit smaller if I want, but what I could also do is I can move this. So down here at the bottom, there's an option called change mode that lets me just slide this out of the way automatically. I can put the invoice image, even if I wanted to eliminate the thumbnail view, I can have the image on one side, and I can just take this particular data entry grid and I can process this any way that I want on the other. The other option is I could also take that invoice and I could move it to another screen automatically. So I can now slide that particular invoice image off to another screen. And now I have the data entry screen that allows me to simply go through and process the invoice as needed, where I'm not necessarily interrupted by having the invoice on, and the data entry grid kind of overlapping, if you will. So some nice tools to be able to use to manage and manipulate where the invoice is as I'm going through and I'm doing the data entry functionality. Other options here, you can email someone right from here. So if, for example, I needed to correspond with someone, maybe at Asphalt and Paving, I could email that particular person or group of people, and then I can just go ahead and attach the invoice or any of the documents that I needed to be able to send along with that particular email. Let's now go to the last invoice, the one that I just acquired here. And this is an invoice for Payne Electric. Now, do you notice here the message that we're getting at the top is that the capture template was not matched. There's not a capture template for this particular invoice. So how do we go about setting one up? Well, let's do that, and we'll actually do that on the fly. So basically what I'm going to do is go into capture templates. And before I go to that particular template, I just wanted to show how the template program works. So basically when I call up a particular template, it's going through the process of defining those particular fields that we want to try and retrieve. And it does this automatically. It's not like this has to be done manually. However, what you can do is you can modify any of the fields that the system automatically captures, if you will, and change it. So for example, if the anchor for Asphalt and Paving, meaning how we're going to identify their particular invoice from other invoices, if it happens to be these two fields and I want to change one of those, I can simply right click, I can make whatever change I need to, and then I can just move things around as needed. Let's go back and let's look at this from a little different perspective. So let's go and add a new capture profile. So we're going to add a new template. We'll call it Payne. We'll use a month-day format. So we'll just go ahead and select the Payne invoice. And when I save this, basically what will happen is it will take a couple of seconds. It will start reading the invoice image, and then it applies the capture template tools directly to that particular invoice. So there's no, in essence, end user intervention here where I have to manually go through and define where the invoice number is, where the billing date is, any of that. The system's going to do it for me. So it's built using what's called a smart extraction, where it is pulling information from that particular document and automatically populating those fields. Now, if, for example, I've gone through and I've pulled in the dollar amount, I've pulled in maybe a description, I've maybe pulled in some other information such as invoice date, due date, invoice number. What I could also do if I move forward here is I can add coding fields. So there might be something on that particular invoice that I can't get from the document. Perfect example, the vendor number. This particular vendor, they didn't put their vendor number on this particular invoice. That's something that's been set up internally in Acumatica. But what I can do is I can go in, I can add a field. Let's say that we want to add the vendor number and we'll call it a fixed field. I can then go out, I can search the vendor master file. And if I wanted to find Payne, for example, and I can do keyword search, whatever I want to do here. But if I don't have something that matches, I can just come in here. And just for right now, we'll just say that it's this particular vendor. I've now added that. I save it. And I'm done at this point, so we'll just go next. It saves that information. It gives me a summary here. If everything looks good and I'm ready to go, I'm finished with that particular template. Now, if we go back to invoice entry, and we go back to the pane invoice, it says the capture template wasn't matched. If we say reload OCR, what it should do is it should go out, it should look for the coding information, and it can then populate that information automatically. Anything that I've already done here, I can go through and I can reload, and it will grab that information as needed. Okay, so we've saved invoices and we've sent them off for review and approval. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch and I'm going to become an approver. So to do that, I'm going to go into document automation. Now, before I go there, I did want to mention that there are a couple of tools that we can use to manage and the status of invoices or documents at any given time. We have some reports. We have the ability to create your own reports and queries, which we'll talk about in a moment. And we have some dashboards, and we also have a notification system. So as that invoice or invoices got routed off to the approvers, a notification was sent to them. And you can set up your own user-defined notifications if you want to perhaps send someone an alert to let them know that they've had invoices routed to them for greater than a certain period of time, for example. So in this case, if I wanted to go in and just use one of the basic reports to say, let me see how many invoices have been routed to John Doe and how long they've been with them, I get a report on the screen that I can see all this information. And then if I need to, I've got more pages, I can build this report, I can download the report, I can print it, I can do whatever I want with a report. But it's just giving me some basic information about that user. I can also do this by job, and then I can kind of move forward from here and manage as need be. And again, using those automated alerts to be able to let people know that they've had invoices routed to them for a period of time, or that maybe it's within 10 days of the due date or something like that. In the document automation program, there is a product called Workflow Execution Status. What this does is it brings up what looks like almost like a dashboard or a kind of a spreadsheet, which you can manipulate. So if I wanted to maybe group by vendor or a particular format, I wanted to sort by date, I can do those types of things. You can see some basic information about the invoices. I can move them off to an Excel spreadsheet or whatever I'd like to do here. So again, kind of more of a dashboard type scenario where I can manage from that particular dashboard what's outstanding at any given time. But I'm going to go into my workflow task queue as an approver. And again, there are a couple of formats that I can use here. One is I can see the information in what looks like kind of more of a card type scenario where I'm seeing the invoices, and right on the screen I have the ability to do certain things, like these particular invoices are invoices that have not necessarily been completely coded to this point. So syncing the task would mean that I'm going to take the information and I'm going to continue coding and perhaps sync the data back to Acumatica. Now, speaking of that, let's take a step back for just a moment before we continue with the approval. And let's go over to Acumatica. Now, the invoices that have been entered in AcumatiScan automatically update into Acumatica. There's nothing additional that needs to take place here. There's no import export. There's nothing other than the fact that I keyed the invoices in AcumatiScan and they've updated into Acumatica. If I go look at an invoice, let's bring up this invoice, a reference 1679. What I'm able to do is I can see that this is an invoice. As you notice, what AcumatiScan has done is we've built a couple of controls inside Acumatica. So if that particular invoice were one that was still out for review and approval, the status here would show that it was locked by AcumatiScan. If it has already been completely processed and the workflow process is complete, then it will show that it has been completely processed in AcumatiScan. So in this case, this is one that has been completed where I could then go out and cut a check against this invoice. What also happens all along the way is that those particular documents that were associated with this, the invoice and any of the supporting docs, are available to me inside Acumatica whenever I want to look at them. So if I come in here and I want to look, I can select that particular invoice, and then I have all of the supporting documents. Here's a purchase order, for example. So I can view this anywhere along the way that I want. Okay, so let's go back for just a moment and talk about different options that are available to the user in AcumatiScan with respect to routing and approval. So what we were talking about was I could take a partially coded invoice and I can send it off to an approver. Let the approvers finish the coding, and then when they're done, the invoice will then update back to Acumatica once the routing and approval process and the approvers have completed that particular workflow. However, AcumatiScan also gives you the ability, depending on, for example, who the vendor is or perhaps what job it's associated with, where the user can update Acumatica automatically once the invoice has been initially entered. So instead of allowing for partial coding, there are some circumstances where maybe for a particular user, maybe for a particular vendor, or maybe for a particular job, you might want partial coding, but maybe in other circumstances you don't. So if you do partial coding, then the approval process would be completed by the approver here. If you update the system automatically, then what would happen is if I were to come in and I wanted to edit the invoice, I would only be making certain specific changes to the invoice, like for example, the cost code, which could then update back to Acumatica as soon as we made those changes. So in this case, because I have a partially coded invoice, I can simply come in, execute the task, bring up the invoice, and now this basically is aligned and laid out exactly the same way that the AP invoice entry screen is designed. So I'm using the same basic tools. I'm allowed to go through here and I can start adding information, start plugging in, and I can go through and finish the coding if need be. And once I'm finished, I can go ahead and either approve or reject that particular invoice. If I reject or I add a note, obviously I have to put some information associated with that to let someone know who I'm rejecting or why I rejected that particular invoice. Approvers also have the ability to add supporting documents if they need to. And again, you have all of those same tools where if I wanted to tile the screens or I wanted to be able to move the invoice off to a second screen, I can do that as well. Now, if we just go back for a moment, we go back in here, also important to note, we can use or approve invoices in any format that we want, as I've mentioned before. So this could be done using a phone, an iPad, or any other type of device that I want. So from here, if I wanted to simulate, in essence, working from a phone, I can then go down through, I can select my invoices, select all my information, and I can code this way. If I were perhaps on an iPad where I had a little bit more real estate, things widen out a little bit more, but I'm still using the same functionality where I'm going through and I'm executing and I'm doing whatever I need to do. Or if we simply bring this back to this format where I'm working in my web browser, I'm working on my desktop or what have you, I'm looking at the invoices in this format. It's a responsive user interface that allows you to be able to approve invoices in whatever format you choose. Okay, so let's say that we had finished the workflow process. And again, if we went back to Acumatica, as mentioned, that's where the concept of process by AcumatiScan would come into play, where those invoices had been completed, the workflow process was done, and they've now been processed, and everything is updated into Acumatica. Now from here, let's say that the user now chooses to go out and process a batch of checks. What AcumatiScan allows is the ability to go through and acquire those checks the same way that you can acquire AP invoices or any other document. Simply note it as a check. We go out, we select those checks either from a file or from wherever they are originated from. It pulls that check information up, and then we go into the attached checks feature. And from here, I could take that batch of checks, and maybe there were 50 checks that we just processed. So I have all 50 checks, one right behind the other, stacked up. Once I go through and I run the attach feature, it ripples through that entire batch, and it attaches each check image to the invoice that it's paying. Now, if this check were paying 5 invoices, it would attach that same check image to all 5 of those invoices. Then back in Acumatica, when we were looking at that particular file, instead of just having the invoice and the purchase order, I would also be able to see the check attached to that particular invoice and the packet as well. Okay, one other item, two other items that we'll cover. First, as I've mentioned, AcumatiScan is not just an AP workflow system. It's a complete document and content management application. So what the user has the ability to do, if they want, is they can acquire any type of document that they choose. So the acquire process stays the same. We go out, we acquire the documents, whether it's dragging and dropping, whether it's scanning, whether it's from email, whatever it might be. But because these are considered documents and not invoices or checks, those actual documents are going into the data entry queue that we see here. What happens with this is that these particular documents are, for example, let's say it's a purchase order, or maybe it is a change order, it's a receiving ticket, packing slip, whatever it might be. The end user has the ability to set up whatever document type and category they want, and they can simply come in here, choose the document type, decide whether or not they want that particular document to be a supporting document, and then they can simply go in and add the coding. And they can put in, for example, the vendor code, maybe the job number, purchase order number, whatever it might be, and then save it. And then that document is now saved as a permanent record in the system. If it's a supporting document, it will be available when the invoice arrives. And if we wanted, we can create a workflow exactly the same as we can create an AP invoice workflow. So I could have routing and approval capabilities for any other type of document in the system. What we also have is the ability to manage those documents and see them and work with them at any given time. That's where the search query comes into play. So from here, if I wanted to, if we were in the middle of, let's say, a job audit, and I needed to be able to go compile all of the documents for a particular job, I would use my query tool to be able to select whatever document I need. So if I said I wanted to go in and do supporting documents, I wanted to find all of my purchase orders for a particular project, I can add a condition to say what project it is, or whatever those documents are, I search and it goes and it finds all of those documents. Or what I can also do is, for the purposes of substantiated billings, maybe a time and material and cost plus billing, where we need to attach the AP invoice backup, I could come in and I could say, let's clear the selection here. Let's do a conditional search. We'll say, in this case, vendor, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to get my asphalt and paving invoices here. We obviously could do this by job. Asphalt paving. I missed it. All right, so let's do it this way. Let's do it that way. And we will search. It goes out, it finds all of those particular invoices and supporting documents associated with this particular search that I did. I can save the search so that if I need to use it again and again, I can do so. I could build this in such a way where I could say, for example, just give me all of the invoices and supporting documents for a particular project for a particular time period, maybe just the month of March, for example. When I do this, I then click on the invoice report. What it will do is it will go out and it will compile an actual report that can be downloaded. And it has not only the report header, but all of the invoices and supporting documents built behind that particular report header. So I can go in here, I can add a title, I can add a subtitle, I can go out and I can select whatever information I want. And then all of the supporting documents are sitting behind the invoice. So in this case, this is a 255-page document that has a lot of invoices that needed to be compiled. So as I start scrolling through here, once we get past the actual report information, I then have all of my supporting documents, all my invoices and everything else. Again, I can download this, create a PDF, where I've now built that packet that can be used for any type of substantiated billing or for, let's say, some sort of a project or job audit. And that is basically it. That's the completion of the presentation. Thank you for viewing, and hopefully we will talk again soon.